Welcome to the Brand Boss Show, empowering you to rock your brand like a boss. This show exists to share all the tools, tips, and secrets you need to maximize the impact of your brand.
Welcome back, Brand Bosses. This is episode 21, and I am incredibly honored to have as my guest this week, you guys, the reason the show even exists. She is, I'm going to let her share her background. She is the podcast expert, in my opinion. She is the inspiration that this show even launched. She is the voice that welcomes you every week, and she is the most boss media person I know. So please welcome with me, Cassidy Atkins.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. That was a great intro. I feel like you should come with me everywhere and do my intro.
Let's do it.
Right? I'm so used to being the voice of people's intro. Now I got my own. That was good.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to talk about all things podcasting.
Yes. So before we jump into that, for anybody who does not have the honor of knowing who you are yet, you want to share a little bit about your background?
Yeah, for sure. So as you said, my name is Cassidy Atkins. I'm the owner of the Creative Podcast Company. I've had 9 years of professional media experience with doing pretty much anything media related, but my heart is definitely with the social media and growth side of stuff, but definitely podcasting. I started the company to help entrepreneurs amplify their message through podcasting because it's one of my favorite medias, as you'll see. I'll probably geek out for the rest of this whole episode.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely my favorite, just helping people get their message out there and helping people understand that their message does matter and that they can change the world with just their voice is definitely why I wake up in the morning and what keeps me up at night, both at the same time. So I definitely love it. I'm super excited to share whatever you want.
All right. Excuse me, there's that dry mouth again. I'll edit that out. So you didn't talk all about your expertise, though.
What did I leave out?
You didn't list all your credentials. I was waiting for you to drop them.
What would you like me to say?
I mean, you've done podcasts for lots and lots of international, like well-known people. We should talk about that.
Okay. I don't even know. Let me pull up my bio.
Okay. Or we could start over and I could read your bio if you want.
That would be awesome. Yeah, sorry about that.
No apologies. Can you send it in Messenger?
Yes, now I gotta find it. Hold on. Aren't you so glad that podcasting isn't live?
Yes.
It really does make life a lot easier.
It does. Like the times that my cats barge in the studio or...
Right? There you go.
All right. There we go. Oh, hey, look at you. Don't even have to pull up a phone. Perfect. All right. Let's start over again. Let me drink more water.
Am I making you nervous? I'm typically when people interview me on their podcast, they're like super like,
I am a little nervous. I'm like, I gotta do this right. It's Cassidy.
I'm definitely not judging you, so let me just blanket that. Yeah.
That makes me feel better.
I'm not the one editing it, so.
True. All right. Start over.
All right.
Scene 1, take 2. Welcome back, Brand Bosses. This week, I am incredibly honored to have as my guest, Cassidy Atkins. Now, you guys, she is the reason this show even exists. She is the inspiration for this show. She is the voice that welcomes you, and she is the most boss media expert I know. To give you a little bit more of her background, she has had 9 years of professional media experience, including radio, television, online journalism, and her podcast, Podception. She is the owner of the Creative Podcast Company that has launched and produced multiple chart-topping podcasts, including her own. She She has internationally trained podcasters in over 8 countries and is passionate about helping people amplify their message and brand. Cassidyy, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm so honored to have you.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I can't wait to talk about all things podcasting.
Yeah. So before we dive in, how about you introduce yourself a little bit more to the brand bosses?
Yeah, definitely. So as you just read, that is my bio. I super love podcasting. I've done a lot of things across the whole media spectrum, as you just said. You know, I've done TV journalism, all that kind of stuff. But there is something about podcasting that just definitely makes me come to life. I really am passionate about helping people amplify their message and letting people know that not only does their message matter, but they really can impact the world with just their voice. So podcasting is definitely my favorite section of media. So I super love it. You'll hear me geek out like the rest of this episode because this is like one of my favorite topics of all time. But on the personal side of stuff, I live in Amarillo, Texas. Me and my husband, we've been together. We've been together a while. We've been married almost 3 years. So we run the company together. So that's super fun. So we get to work together. He's also a musician and he's super hot and he has a British accent. So that's always worth, yeah, that's always worth mentioning no matter what. So yeah, that's pretty much all you need to know. I love media, love Daniel, want to help people get their message out there.
That's awesome. I love it. Well, let's dive right in and let you geek out about all things podcasting. And, you know, brand bosses, with this, we're kicking off a series to put practical tools in your hands that you can start using right now. You know, this is a season where so many businesses are going, okay, how can I pivot online? How can I get my message online? How can I do this? And there is honestly, in my opinion, no one better to kick off this series with than Cassidyy. So Cassidyy, I'm just going to turn it over to you and look forward to all the wisdom you're going to drop today.
Yeah, exactly. I'm super excited. I think that you're so right. You know, people are looking to move more online. And there's one thing I want to address before we get, too deep into the technical mumbo jumbo. Is that so many people, yes, are moving online, but there's also this almost connotation of fear that comes with it because people are like, oh, I should have done this years ago. I should have been more prepared for this. I should have, everyone now is trying to move online, but it's under this weird, umbrella of I should have already done this. And now it's almost like you're in a default mode of catch up, right? And so you can't really create, and you can't really extend your brand when you're operating off of this, gosh, I should have done this forever ago. If you're constantly beating yourself up, you're not going to create great content. So I just wanted to start it with that for the person out there that's like almost stressed out by even this episode. Like, gosh, this is how you do podcasting. Like I should have been doing this forever ago. I'm never going to get around to that. So I wanted to address that first and foremost, because I think despite popular opinion, podcasting is just getting started, really. Because I'm going to read you some statistics real quick because I want to talk about the power of podcasting. But I think that podcasting specifically in this season that we're in, you know, at the time of this recording, you know, all the COVID craziness is going on right now. And so that's primarily who I'm addressing. But this is really, you know, for everybody, because I think that when you decide to do something, whether that's a blog, a YouTube show, whatever, the first thing you're going to notice is everyone else that's already doing it, right? So just because everyone else is already doing it doesn't mean they're doing it like you. So there is still a space for you in all these media places. But let's dive into specifically podcasting because it really is just getting started. So just a few stats I want to rattle off because I'm definitely a stat person. I think everyone needs to know the stats about their industry. But here's why there's a lot of power in podcasting right now. So I literally pulled these numbers today before this recording. I wanted to make sure I was giving like the most accurate information. So currently there is 900,000 podcasts right now. So 900,000. Really, when you hear that number, you're probably like, gosh, that's so many. But when you look at YouTube or blogs or something like that, it's not even in the same realm of competition. There's billions of blogs with a B, billions of blogs. There's millions upon millions upon millions of YouTube shows. Everyone and their dog is doing a Facebook Live. So you have to look at it in the context of everything else. So 900,000 really isn't that much. But if you take a closer look at those numbers, there's only 250,000 active podcasts. The definition of an active podcast is they have more than 10 episodes. Okay, so you have an active podcast. It's episode number 21. Yeah. So check that. And then you have had a new episode within the last 90 days. So in the past 3 months, you've had an episode and you have more than 10. That's the definition of an active podcast. Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy. That is absolutely crazy.
Yes, exactly. So I think that podcasting is such an untapped market still, even with the COVID craziness, even with, this world of digital marketing that we're living in. I think that now is the best time to start a podcast. Definitely. And the worst time to start a podcast is tomorrow. I always tell people that. Good. Right? I always tell people that because you've got to do it. You just got to do it. You got to pull the trigger, and you can't worry about, oh, I should have done this forever ago. The only time that you're behind is when you start tomorrow, in my opinion.
Oh, that's so good. Put that on a quote card. Anyway, continue.
that can be your audiogram for this episode.
Yes.
But often people ask me, they're like, okay, but is my ideal client or is my ideal audience even in the podcast world as a business owner, as an entrepreneur? Because that's great that you don't have a lot of competition, 250,000, but is it likely a good customer is going to be there is a question I always get, especially from brand bosses, right? So first of all, 85% of all listeners finish the episode, which is the highest consumption rate in media. So wow. Right? So a lot of people, click on a Facebook Live and then they jump off. A lot of people don't have time to, watch a whole Netflix show or watch a whole YouTube show or whatever, right? Everyone's got a busy life, even if we are on quarantine. We all still got stuff to do, right? So 85% finish the entire episode. So people are consuming your content like crazy, which means you can build a really, really great relationship with your listeners quickly. And also on the other side of that, the average person subscribes up to 7 podcasts. So you're not necessarily even fighting against other people they already listen to, because the one thing about podcast listeners is that they love listening to podcasts. The average person subscribes to 7. That's insane. And then they're finishing 85% of all those episodes. The only reason that those get brought down, that number gets brought down, is if, they're an active listener and they just skip over the intro because they know they're going to listen anyway. You don't have to hook them, right? Or they know your website, they know your social media, they follow you, so they don't listen to the outro. That's the only thing that drives that number down to 85. Right?
Yeah.
So it's very interesting how much people want content in the podcast space. They're like content hounds. They cannot get enough of it, right? So with subscribing up to 7 podcasts, that's roughly, say everyone has an hour-long episode, that's at least 7 hours a podcast listener is listening to content all the way through. Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing. It's funny. I'm listening to you and I'm like, yeah, that's me. That's definitely me. I've got it on in the background while I'm working. I've got it on while I'm washing my dishes or, doing stuff around the house, whatever. So at 7 hours feels like a lot when you say that. But when I think about even just for me, how I consume content like that, oh yeah, I could see how that would happen. But it is really interesting to your point. We always kind of view things through our own lens. It's interesting to think about, yeah, I am that person who will hop on a Facebook Live and get some good content and then hop off, or, I have my nights where I binge watch food vlogs on YouTube, all night or whatever. But when it comes to a podcast, it is extremely rare. In fact, I'm trying to think of if there was ever a time that I started a podcast episode and didn't finish it. Even if I got interrupted or something, I went back to it later because I wanted to hear the rest of it. So it's just so interesting that this platform really, I don't know, what is it that you think that keeps people that engaged? Is it just that people are putting out really great content, or that people on this platform just really want to hear what people have to say?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of 2 different sides of it. No one is making somebody listen to a podcast ever. I think that there's like a little bit of guilt when it comes to like Facebook Lives, like, your friend's going, so you feel like you kind of have to jump on and you listen and then you kind of jump off. You know what I mean? Like there's no like weird like
that's
guilt,
real. That's
right?
real.
Like
Especially in our circles, that's real.
Oh, sure. Everyone lives on Facebook Live. So I think that there's no like, oh, I've got to go check this out in the podcast space right now. Like no one's forcing me to subscribe to a show and listen to it. So really you can listen to whatever you want and whatever niche industry, like side hustle, project, crafting, whatever you're into, right? Like whatever that is, there's a podcast for it. And it's typically really good and it has that educational piece to it because podcasters are like, I don't know that. What is the saying? It's like leaders or readers. It's
yes.
like, yeah. It's like podcast listeners are like the innovators in the world. Like they're always the one that's wanting to learn and wanting to know more and wanting to go more and do more and be more. So I think that just the caliber of people that the podcast industry attracts is way higher because again, no one's making you do it. Like you have to make the decision to go find the show and subscribe to the show and it downloads to your phone and listen to it, right? So that's one side of it. But the other side is, because I don't think that everyone puts out great content, so I don't think it's the content piece. So I think what it is what you said. Like you just rattled off 5 different ways you listen to podcasts when you're doing the dishes, when you're going out, when you're, you know what I mean? Podcasting is very on the go. Like I can, push play and slip my phone in my pocket and keep doing what I'm doing. I can go about my life and listen to a podcast. Most people have to sit down again and watch that YouTube show. Like you just said, you have to binge food blogs in bed because you're watching, right? Like you're laying in bed watching it. That's a rare occasion. You don't always have time to binge watch food blogs, but you can listen to a podcast no matter where you're at, what you're doing. And the entire industry was built off of that mobile experience, that mobile device. So it already is like ingrained in the identity of the industry that you're listening to this on the go. YouTube really started on computers. So there's still that, like, I had to sit down and watch it, part of it, that element. So I think that that's mostly it. I think that's why so many people can listen anywhere and do anything. And no one's forcing them to listen to anything, and you don't feel any guilt if you don't listen to it, so they can subscribe to whatever they want and unsubscribe to whatever they want. Like there's almost like this weird guilt when you unfollow somebody on social media, but if I unsubscribe to a podcast, no one ever knows. So there's like a lot of freedom, right, for the user experience.
That's true. That's such a good point. Yeah, it always makes me laugh when, and this, I don't mean this negatively at all, but people are like, oh, I really would love to listen to podcasts, but I just don't have time. And I'm thinking, what do you listen to when you're driving? What do you listen to when you travel? What do you listen to? Because to your point, like it really is, I feel like something about the podcast platform has done such a great job. And maybe, like you said, it's the people, like you and I who listen to it, who want to always learn, who want to always be like increasing our knowledge and whatever. They've just done such a good job of positioning themselves to mesh with real life. Like you don't have to have a window of time that's perfectly silent with nothing going on where you're not doing anything else in order to receive and digest the content from a podcast. In fact, I feel like that never happens. I don't ever listen to a podcast when I'm not doing something else in the background. So
yeah, 100%. And, it definitely shows up that podcast listeners are typically more educated, are those learners, are those go-getters, really in the numbers as well. That was going to be my next point of the question of, are my ideal customers even listening to podcasts? The average household income for podcast listeners is $75,000 a year in America. So if you don't think that that family has some expendable income to spend on your product or service, like, that is a great household income number to find customers. Am I right?
Oh, yeah. Sign me up for those.
Right? Exactly. So also within that same conversation, 52% of men and 48% of women listen to podcasts. So it's like almost a 50-50 split, which also is really rare in the media space. So whether your ideal who or avatar or lifer is a man or a woman, they're going to be in the podcast world. They're going to be making around $75,000 a year, and they're going to finish all your content. So it's like, I promise you, your ideal customer is going to be listening to a podcast.
Yeah, I think that this is, and I'm so excited for you to keep digging into this more. I think this is an area to reach potential customers that not enough people are talking about. You know, I had a conversation with somebody back in December with a potential client, and they wanted to do, sorry, but I'm just going to be real because it's my show and I can do that. They wanted to do a 20-page leave behind sales packet to who they told me were busy grocery store owners. I'm sorry, if you have a busy grocery store owner, they're not going to read 20 pages of a sales packet. And so I asked him, I said, okay, well, what else are you thinking about as far as, you know, connecting with these people? And they're like mentioning all of these things. Like, no, you have to think about where this person is at. Like, you have to put yourselves in the shoes of this person. If they're running around and they've got this going on and they have to deal with this and whatever, like, they're not going to have time to sit down and go through a 20-page sales packet. And if they do, they're probably going to feel a little like begrudgingly doing it, you know, about the time that they're losing. Versus if you put out content that, first of all, serves them, provides value to them, you know, isn't just like, here I am, this is me, look at my stuff, it's amazing, which is essentially what that sales packet is doing. But if you're providing content to them that helps them where they're at, that they can consume in their world, they could have it, you know, going in their earphones while they're, you know, doing stuff around the store, whatever. Like, if you can reach, and that's just one example, but I feel like this is such an important platform to reach busy business owners, to reach entrepreneurs, to reach, you know, all of these people who are not necessarily going to have the time to sit down and digest content in other platforms. And so it's such a overlooked, I guess, avenue, I think, when it comes to connecting with and really serving your customer base, whoever that might be. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. You know, it all comes down to like who you're serving and what you're doing. Cause, you know, I have actively told people not to start a podcast as well. You know, yeah, if their ideal, you know, client is probably more readers and they are already hanging out at other blogs, I tell people to start a blog. Like, getting your message out there is the most important thing, and like amplifying it, making sure it gets to as many people as it can. But you have to be aware of who you're serving for sure. Like, that is a horrible scenario you just laid out. Like, I didn't even know what a 20-page leave behind was. I was like, what is that? Until you explained it. So that is a horrible way to capture me if you wanted me as a client, right? So you have to figure out, is podcasting going to work for who you want to influence? Yeah. Because there's a lot of people, because think about it, there's the numbers I just laid out, there's 90,000 podcasts out there, but only 250,000 active podcasts. I would suggest to you that 250,000 is serving their clients in a way that makes sense, right? And not all those are business podcasts, of course, but I'm just saying that is a massive drop off. There's a lot of people who have not continued their podcast, and it probably was because A, it wasn't getting into the hands of the right people, or their ideal clients or audience definitely is not an audio learning group.
True.
So it really does come down to a lot of questions, you know, and, you know, that's the question we want to ask today is, does your business even need a podcast? And I think that that's really where you start is, who are you trying to serve and why? Like, what do you need to give them? You know what I mean? Because I definitely don't think that me sending out pamphlets to podcasters is ever going to work. Like, that's just not going to happen.
It's just so ridiculous. I have to laugh. Sorry.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, it's just not going to work. And is it going to be through Instagram that's going to be my best ad spin, or is it going to be through Facebook? Like, you have to get really, really clear on who you can bring the most value to, because I can't bring value to every single podcaster like me. And this is, I'm like really like contemplating like how real I should get. So I had let me just say this. I specialize in 6 to 7 figure business podcasts, people that already have a brand, already are doing something. I don't typically work with startup podcasters, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like passion project, I'll say that because I work with startups. That's my whole business is I launch people's podcasts. But so, I mean like more passion projects, doing it just kind of for fun, right? Like you're a perfect example. Like you already have, you know, the Brand Boss Studio, you have things going on, right? Like I like to help people amplify their message, meaning they have a message already. Okay, so now that groundwork is laid, where was I going with this? What was your last question? Sorry.
Fine. No, and I was gonna say, like, I mean, we get real on here, and like oh no, I don't want to end it. I was just gonna close the chat box. Never mind. Close the chat box because it was distracting me. There we go. No, we get real on here. Like when I had Julia on, basically the only thing that I edited out was essentially a salvation message, and I edited it out for time. So,
okay. I remember where I was going. People, you got to know who you can serve. Okay.
Yeah, you got to know who you can
serve.
So get as real as you want. You're good.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. So you already have a message, right, that you want to amplify. You already have something going on. Well, a few months ago, and I've been doing this for years, right? So this is like a rookie move. I can't believe I even did this. And the results, I was like, of course this freaking happened. So as a professional courtesy to someone, I took on, you know, a client that was a little bit more passion project, a little bit more startup, didn't really know what was going on. And we had a horrible working relationship. Like awful. Like she hated me. I couldn't freaking stand her. Like it just was not good, right? Like it got so bad. But I took her on and she needed a lot of hands-on help. She needed a lot of nurturing. Frankly, she just needed a friend, right? Like to help her out. And so me typically working with high-level entrepreneurs and business owners, I was treating her like a business owner, and she needed to be treated like a person with a passion project. Mm-hmm. So those are very different conversations. So we ended that relationship, obviously, but I felt awful because it went against my full identity of my brand. And I knew that she had a crappy experience. Like I'll take it all on me because that's not who I want to serve. And that's not even who I'm equipped to serve. So you have to really understand who you're serving before you ever get your message out there. And I know like we're pretty far into this episode and I've really been like hammering into that, but that's like the first question that you need to ask yourself if your business needs a podcast, because your business might not be a podcast. I did not need to work with that lady because I have a great business. I've got great testimonials. I'm not being arrogant. I'm just being real. I'm just saying I work with, you know, really influential people, and I could not help this woman to save my life. So I knew like I gave her such a bad experience. Like I gave her a partial refund. Like it was like not good. Right. Oh, no. So that relationship did not have to be that way if I would have held myself to a standard, right? You have to be really honest, not only with who you want to serve, but be self-aware of who can you serve, because she was testing my patience like crazy. Like she asked me how to get to Google one time.
No.
And I was, yes. So I'm like, okay, you got to have a little bit of tech knowledge before you work with me, because I don't even know how to explain the question, where is Google? Like, that like doesn't even compute in my brain, right? So I really was like, oh my gosh, I'm a horrible entrepreneur. I'm a horrible person to her. And I have to be okay with her I have to be okay with her thinking I'm an awful business owner, right? And that wasn't even anything to do with her. That was for me, because I was not self-aware enough to understand like I can't even deliver well to this person. And she doesn't even need a podcast. And even if she went through my courses, she wouldn't even understand it anyway.
No, because she'd still be trying to figure out how to get to Google.
Exactly. So I say that as like step number 1, does your business need a podcast? Do your people need a podcast from you? That's
I love that. I love the way you just phrased that. Do your people need a podcast from you? Because it's all about showing up and serving who you can best serve. And I really thank you for sharing that story. I love that you shared that story, because so many of us go into business because we genuinely want to help others. And if we're not careful, we can fall into this, I just want to help so I can help you. I just want to help so I can help you. I just want to help so I can help you. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the person standing in front of you is the person that you're best equipped to help. There might be somebody else who is better equipped to help that person. And if you take them on and you try to help them when you're not best equipped to help them in that way, first of all, they're missing out on working with the person who could better help them. And it's going to be, like you pointed out, a terrible experience for everybody involved. Like, I have definitely had those stories as well. So thank you for sharing that. And it really comes down to, do the people that you serve need you to show up for them in the way of a podcast, right?
Right. Definitely. And that's like step number 2. Like, are you starting a podcast because you want to hear your own voice? Like, do you feel like you need one as yourself? Because that is one of the most off-putting things to podcast listeners, is when it's all about you. So you always have to remember that you have a great podcast for your audience. You don't have a great audience because of your podcast.
That's so good. Yes.
So,
say that again for the people in the back. Because most podcasters that I know are like, oh my gosh, I got to get on the mic. Or you're listening to the, recording. You're like, that's really my voice. I really sound like that. Okay, I can do this.
Yeah, definitely. So you really have to be super self-aware of all of those things that I just laid down, and really remembering that your show is about your listeners, for sure. And if you just get on the mic and you're helping one person, like, are you going to be okay with that? If you have like slow growth, are you going to be okay with that one person getting like a lot of breakthrough from your show? And I would say, yes, that is worth it. And if that's not okay for you, then I would ask you again, why did you start your podcast? So
good.
Always remember that. So, sorry.
You're good.
So as far as like, just continuing the conversation, does your business need a podcast? You also really have to ask yourself, is this even going to fit into my business's ecosystem? Do you have a sustainable platform that will actually complement or take away from a podcast? Because let me just say, I think that you have to have other stuff going on before you start a podcast. I think that you need to have, obviously, a solid website, a solid funnel. You need to have social media presence. You need to have all these things. Now, can you start a podcast with no website and no social media? 100%. That's one of the reasons why people do like podcasting, is because the startup, like the entry level is so low. Like, you don't need all these other things, right? But I think that your podcast has to really make sense in what other things you have going on. Do people find you on social media and then you take them to the podcast? Or is your primary source of lead gen going to be your podcast, and then that you bring them into the social media for more connection and to join the conversation? You really have to identify where your podcast fits into your brand and what role it's going to serve. Because I hear so many podcasters, get on the show and they're like, hey, make sure you follow us on social media and do this and this and this and this. And I always wonder, I'm like, I wonder if they really thought about that. Because why would you, here's my caveat to all this. I think you should be all places all the time. Your brand should be crammed down everybody's throat. That's how you're successful, right? But I think you need to really, one, go back to how can you give people breakthrough? How can you give this product or service, to the right people in the right way at the right time? And how are you building those relationships with your ideal audience, right? So let me just say that, yes, all that's important. I also do social media, so I'm not saying social media is evil. I just want to really stay in the vein of the conversation of podcasting, right? So if you have a great social media presence, say you have, let's just use this as an example. You have 1,000 followers and they're super engaged and they're super, blah, blah, blah. On average, your audience will see maybe 10% of your posts. So 10% of your audience are actually going to see your post. So if there's 1,000 people that say, yes, I've raised my hand, I want to see brand boss content, like this is my brand, these are my people, these are my, this is my tribe, right? I want to run with these people. I need Rachel to teach me all the things. I like the page, I follow the page, all these things. Only 100 of those 1,000 people are going to see your content, most likely with the algorithm setup. And that's across the board, whether that's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. It's about a 10% ratio of people who actually follow you and the people who actually see your content. Now, on the other side of that, in the podcast world, if someone raises their hand and say, hey, I want to see this content, I'm going to subscribe, that content is coming to my phone every single week, and I don't have to do anything about it. And I get to spend an hour, 2 hours, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever. I'm spending all that time with you. I'm always going to see your content. I'm going to be able to build a relationship with you as a host, as a listener listening to the host. And you're going to be able to give me a lot more value in a 15 minute, 30 minute, hour long show than a quote graphic on social media. So you always have to ask yourself, what's going to be your primary lead generation? Is it going to be social media? And that's awesome if that's what you're going to do. And it adds all these things. You can obviously be very successful on social media, and you can take people off that platform and bring them into your podcast, or you're going to use your podcast to bring them onto social media. But why would you bring them onto social media? Like what is the role of your podcast going to be inside your brand? Does that make sense?
That does. And I love the way that you're laying that out and explaining that, because I think, as business owners, particularly business owners who like to be, ahead of the curve, like sometimes they can feel this pressure, like, okay, you have to do this and you have to be here and you have to do this and you have to do that. And so, I have to have you have to be crushing it on social, and you have to be crushing it, including on social, you have to be crushing it on, Instagram, and you have to have Facebook ads running, and you have to be crushing it on LinkedIn, and you have to be crushing it here, and you have to be here and here. And it's exhausting because you still have a business to run and grow and all of the things and people to show up and serve. And so you want to show up the right way, and you want to do it well, and you want to do it with excellence. Like you just pointed out, it's really, okay, this isn't just one more thing that I'm doing to do, but how is this piece going to fit into the overall puzzle of our brand and what we're doing to show up and serve the people that we want to serve?
100%. Yeah. And I think some of the best podcasters have the worst social media presence because they understand that they're able to serve better on the podcast platform. And there's really no reason for them to follow me on Instagram or follow me on LinkedIn, because I'm already over delivering on the podcast platform, and they're already getting more of me than they would anywhere else. So it's very interesting, the podcasters that are successful, really successful, how often their social media is. Now, there is people that have definitely cracked the code, and they're just content creating machines, much like Joe Rogan. He's the top podcaster in the world, and he very obviously knows how to have a great YouTube show, make it a great audio experience, take a video from that, post it on social media, grab a quote from this, tag this person. Yes, there is a great ecosystem it can work in, but all those other things have to be happening. So how can your podcast fit into your ecosystem? And is it actually going to be smarter to focus on the podcast and not really worry about social media when you get it launched? Always make it come down to, how can you impact the most people, and how can you serve them all better than you currently are? Is a quote graphic today on social media going to serve them, or coming up with, the top things you should do with X, Y, and Z? Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
So that's why I love podcasting, is because you really can over deliver to people with, really not that much effort. In my opinion, as a content strategist for years for big social media platforms, and from being a podcast producer for those same brands, it's so much easier for my clients to sit down and just talk about something and do the podcast thing, or jump on a Facebook Live and then save that audio and turn that into a podcast, than it is coming up with a perfect quote graphic, or have we made so many connections on LinkedIn this week? All those little things, not that they're not important, but they can be a little bit more tedious, and you can definitely over deliver. And also, since I brought up repurposing content, that's a big key for people. They're like, yeah, I think that my audience would benefit from, a podcast, but I just don't have time to add another thing in. That's going to be a huge, huge trend moving forward in the podcast world. I feel like people are kind of understanding, oh, I can make content really work for me, right? So if I can do a Facebook
point right now.
Right, exactly. So, if you can do a Facebook Live and it sound awesome. And then obviously like get a good mic and whatnot. But I'm just saying, if you
Do
can
it.
get
Otherwise, Cassidy will hunt you down.
right, yeah, just make sure your audio sounds good if you're going to repurpose. That's my only point. So if you can get on a Facebook Live and now you serve to your social media, audience, and then you save that audio and turn it into a podcast, edit it a little bit so it doesn't sound weird, like make it an audio experience. That is going to be so strategic for so many or so many podcasters in general, but especially in the business world, because like you said, like we're busy and it can be exhausting doing all these different things because you also still have a business to run. But I would say making sure you can make your content work for you is going to be a really easy way to answer, does your business need a podcast actually?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to one of the basic business principles, which is the principle of leverage. Like, can you leverage your podcast to accelerate and, amplify your message and accelerate your brand in more ways than one?
Yeah.
Can you, and reach your people? I've heard you say this before, but I'd never thought about it the way that you just said it in terms of, with algorithms on Instagram and Facebook and whatever, the percentage that gets that content versus it's true. Like every Tuesday, Brand Boss community knows they have, an episode from me. And I know that there's going to be an episode from the FAQ show. And I know there's going to be, and so I know that when I pull out my phone, it'll be there and I can just start listening to it and enjoy it. And nobody forced me to sign up for that. But there's also nobody keeping me from receiving it, which I think is very interesting. Like there's no barrier there between your audience and your content.
Exactly. And like, yeah, it comes out on Tuesday, but I can listen to it on Thursday or Saturday, or, if I miss your Facebook or Instagram live, like I'm not going to see it. Like the algorithm is not going to show me your live from Tuesday on Saturday when I have time. So there's a lot of time barriers within it as well. So the conversation really is, how can you eliminate all barriers between your ideal audience and your content?
Yeah, absolutely. And podcasting is clearly a powerful way to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Now, if you are like listening to this and you like don't really know like what to even start, like where to even start from, like here, all the things we've talked about. I know we've kind of been a little all over the place, but I think there's just so many elements that go into it to even answer that question. Does your business need a podcast? Because it's so different for each and every audience. But one of the common mistakes I see people make is they're like, yeah, I'm going to start a podcast. And they just start like Googling and researching. And there's so much bad information out there about podcasting. First of all, but really just narrowing in on like the foundations of your podcast is going to be what makes or breaks your show. A lot of people can put out great content, but if you didn't focus on the foundations, then no one's ever going to see it and it doesn't matter anyway. And it's probably just going to sit there on your website and it's going to look great and you have a podcast. Now you can say that, but it's really not serving you or anybody else. So before you ever hit the mic, before you ever record anything, buy the mic off Amazon or whatever you're about to do, you have to worry about these 5 things. First of all, your show name, obviously. So many people, think of, like the Cassidy Atkins audio experience or something like that.
The fishing show.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a fishing show or something. But you really have to think about what are people actually searching in your niche and industry, because I'll tell you what, no one is searching Cassidy Atkins. That's not like some weird like dig it myself. I'm just saying that's the fact of the matter. No one's really searching my name. So is that really going to benefit me, right? If your show is like your company name and your company name is like, I don't know, Alpha, I don't know, Star Show or something. I don't know, some terrible name that no one is searching is my point. You have to think of other ways that you can marry your brand and something that's going to work in your favor. So if it's like, Alpha Star business tips people are searching for, right? Like no one's searching for Alpha Star. I don't even know where that came from. So my point is like, how can you make your show name work for you? Because it might be true if you're a solopreneur or if you're a startup or if you're just getting started with really focusing in on branding, like your SEO of your name and your business name might not be great for the podcast world. So how can you extend that? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Next, you need to worry about your subtitle. There's very few fields that are actually optimized for SEO or SEO optimized. I'm saying SEO optimize.
That's funny.
So there are very few fields that are actually SEO oriented, like that are actually recognized by the algorithm. So when people search, things show up. A lot of people think that your show notes are optimized, and they're not. Like your show notes are not being recognized in the search engines of all these apps. So you have to really focus in on what that is recognizing. One of those, of course, is your show name and your subtitle. A lot of people skip over the subtitle section, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's such wasted real estate. So how can, and especially if you have a brand that doesn't necessarily make sense, like you hear it and you don't necessarily know what it is automatically, then your subtitle can really work in your favor. So you can have like your hook, a little bit more about your show in the subtitle. If your subtitle, I don't know what yours is actually, Rachel.
Empowering you to rock your brand like a boss.
Boom, there you go. So that's actually good. But for example, you could be like, weekly business tips or weekly branding tips or branding tips, for every entrepreneur, things like that. Like those are just examples of how to let people know more about your show and things that are keyword and has a lot of good of those juicy SEO words, in the subtitle. Those are just examples, because you want to have a pretty clear explanation of what your show is going to be about before they ever hit play. So next, you need to focus on your artwork. So many people have horrible artwork, and this is like one of the biggest pain points for me. When I look at stuff, I'm like, I'm sure your show's great, but I'm never listening to it, because your artwork is like the front door of your show. You know this, Rachel, as a designer.
I do. There's been some podcasts that I'm like, oh, that's interesting content, but then as soon as I'm like, nope, I'm not gonna listen to you. Nope.
Yes, exactly. Your artwork is your front door of your podcast. It has to look good. It has to look welcoming. It's intriguing. You don't want to have like some like rusty door with like the screen missing and all this stuff. Like no one's going to come into your ratchet home because of your crusty door. So make sure that your artwork looks really good. And you have to think about it in all different devices. Like where is your artwork going to exist? A lot of people are using the dark mode on iPhones now. Most Android users have dark mode. Everything's black. Now, traditionally, a lot of people were designing for the Apple interface, which everything was white. But as soon as they turned on that dark mode, their podcast really got lost in everything else, because it's black. The artwork's black, the interface is black, so now it just blends in. So think about where your artwork is going to exist and what's going to really catch your ideal listener's eye. Next, obviously, you got to think about your content. Do not get on the mic and just say, hey, we're just going to talk about whatever today. Really get clarity on what you want to deliver. Your content's important. And then each and every episode title is also SEO recognized. So those are like the 5 things that you constantly, well, not constantly, because once your subtitle and stuff like that's done, you never have to worry about it again. But your content and episode titles are what you're going to constantly need to worry about moving forward after you launch. But before you ever record, your show name, your subtitle, and your artwork, those are things you have to knock out of the park. And now those 3 things really are going to make or break your show.
And I know when it comes to, I'm harping on the artwork for a second because that's my jam. There are a lot of specifications, particularly that Apple has, that if people don't meet them, that the show can actually get rejected just because of the artwork.
Yeah.
You want to touch on that for a minute?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, there's a ton of different specifications for the artwork. And this is where, it, like I said, it is a low entry level or like barrier to start a podcast. So people do love it because of that, as I've said. But for things like this is where you got to get a professional in. You got to hire a designer, like call Rachel, call anybody. Like just don't do it yourself, because you're going to run into so many problems if you try to take on something like this, especially with the specifications. Because I'm going to rattle them off, and if you don't know what at least one of these definitions or these things mean, that is like your clue that you need a designer. All right. So now that that's been said, you have to design it in 3000 by 3000 pixels in size. The old number was 1400 by 1400. That's old news now. You're still going to find that if you Google it, but it's now 3000 by 3000 pixels in size. Everything has to be designed in RGB colors, and you cannot have any Apple or any sort of destination logos. So you can't have a Spotify logo, a Google logo, anything like that. You cannot have any sort of logos on your artwork because, one, they don't want people to think this is an Apple endorsed podcast. And then why would Apple want their competitor's logo being advertised in their system? You know what I mean? So definitely avoid all logos. And then this one's really funny. You have to have, no, you can't have any sort of Apple-like products on your artwork. So anything that even looks like an iPhone, a Mac, AirPods, an iPad, anything like that, you cannot have any sort of Apple-like products or literal Apple products on your artwork because, again, they think that you're good. Because again,
I'm not gonna sneeze.
Oh, you're good. Because again, they don't want you to be promoting anything so people think that it's an Apple endorsed show. Lastly, this one is definitely something that is pretty commonly not known. It's very interesting. Apple just started. It's very interesting the way the podcast world works. It's like all the producers know stuff about Apple, but Apple won't ever say it publicly. So it's always like the podcast producers are like interpreting Apple's weirdness to the podcaster. So it's very strange how they all lay things out. But this one is very commonly not known. And this is something they're just now like, yeah, that's for sure true. Because for a while, it was like they tried to make things a little bit complicated to keep the content higher, because if anyone and their dog could just start a podcast, then like the content's pretty low across the board. So I feel like, I don't know this for sure, I feel like they made things a little needlessly complicated and hidden, and you only knew it if you were in the know, which led to better content. If they did that, good job, because it worked. So this last one is the most complicated and the most unknown. It has to be 500 or under kilobytes in size. So you have to compress that 3000 by 3000 pixel artwork lower than 500 kilobytes. And that one is like the biggest trigger, because you have to think about it. Apple has to store all these files somewhere. And Apple actually makes zero money off of podcasting. Zero. Most people don't know that.
No, that's crazy.
Yeah, so they make zero money off of it. So if they can cut corners and keep the storage of all those files low, they're going to. So 500 kilobytes in size is your number one reason why you're going to get rejected. And if you do have a podcast and you're listening to this, go check this now, because if your file is over 500 kilobytes, your show's actually going to get super buried and throttled in the algorithm, because the number one thing that triggers you getting kicked out of Apple and your artwork is that size or higher than that size or whatever, is when you actually get into the charts. So you might have been able to fly under the radar, which means your show's never been in the charts. As soon as you find success in the podcast world, as soon as you get on the charts, they're going to delete your show. You're going to have to go to Apple jail. You're going to have to go to them and ask, hey, can I get out of here? Like, I didn't know, you're going to have to give them all these excuses. And frankly, Apple doesn't care. I've helped a few podcasters get out of Apple jail, and it is a pain in the butt. It takes weeks. And I've seen podcasters lose their entire audio, like lose it completely. They had to start over from scratch because Apple didn't let it back. And their artwork was 700 kilobytes, so only 200 kilobytes bigger than the requirement, and they deleted it totally. That was one of their primary sources of revenue. That was like one of their biggest ways they served their audience. That was their biggest lead gen, like all these things, right? Apple doesn't care. You were outside of the lines. So make sure you're following the guidelines so strictly, like over the top strictly. And that goes for the pixel size as well. I've seen people get their show deleted because it was 3000 by 3001. It was one pixel off.
Whoa. That's
Yeah.
crazy. I mean, these increments, for people who don't understand the design speak about it, like the difference between 500 kilobytes and 700 kilobytes is like ridiculously small. So
It's like,
it's like nothing. So like following it to the T, and I just want to interject for a moment for any Android listeners who are not Apple fans, they might be like, oh, okay, well, I don't care about Apple. No, you do care about Apple. Do you want to touch on that for a second about why like you want to play by Apple's rules? Because pretty much Apple is the one, I believe, like Apple is the one kind of setting the table for podcasters right now. And like that's the party you want to be a part of. Do you agree with that?
yeah, over 70% they control over 70% of the market. So like over 70% of podcast listeners listen on Apple. And yes, you're right. You have to play by Apple's rules because podcasting is Apple. It doesn't matter what anybody says. The top 3 podcast apps out there are Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast. Now, those are the top 3, but the difference, like the tiny amount of the market that Spotify and Google actually controls is so, so small. And you cannot have a successful podcast without being in Apple, because here's what happens. Once you're in Apple, over 200 plus other apps pick up your show because they pull directly from the Apple directory. So if you're not in Apple, you're doing nothing with your podcast. Like, don't even start it because you're missing out on not only the 70% of the people that are actually listening from Apple Podcasts, but also all of the other aggregator apps that are pulling from Apple Podcast. So yeah, you can choose not to listen on Apple Podcast, and that's fine. But if you're actually wanting to get your message out there, and if you're actually wanting to like influence people and grow your brand, like, you are wasting your time if you're not in Apple. They definitely are the ones who control the majority of the market. So you got to play in their sandbox for sure.
Cool. Thank you for just clarifying that for us. So my goodness, we've talked about a lot of things, but I feel like this is a really important episode because so many of these things, like you hear about podcast, or, back in the day you heard about blogging, or, you hear about like your Instagram presence or whatever. And it's easy, like so many things, I think particularly for entrepreneurs, to get sucked into a little bit of the cool factor of it. And like, okay, I'm going to do this because like, ooh, I have a podcast now. Ooh, I've got all this like content marketing out now. Ooh, I've got all of this, whatever. And I love how you've really like drilled into really the strategy behind it. And like, this is why it matters, or maybe it doesn't matter for your business. This is what you need to know going into it. Like, you've really kind of, in some ways, leveled the playing field a little bit. So it's like, okay, so you might listen to podcasts and go, okay, that's awesome. I don't know if I could ever do that. And now it's like, okay, you can. You just need to think about this. And just as a business owner, going back to where I was before I started, I had no clue how to get started. And I know that's a much, much bigger conversation than we have time for today. But is there, I don't know, maybe like 3 things that you would say to any business owner who's heard what you've had to say today and says, okay, you know what? Like, Cassidy is a really good point. I could see how I could really serve my audience this way. And actually, I think they need me to show up for them like that. But I have no clue where to even begin. I wrote down the things that you said about like title and subtitle and artwork, and okay, like we'll figure those things out. But I don't even know where to get started. What would you say to somebody who finds themselves in that position right now?
I would say go to creativepodcast.co.
Absolutely.
Go to the website. I'm just kidding. Well, not really, but yes, I would say.
No, it's true. It's what I did.
but I really would say, do you have time? This is the first question I ask everybody. Do you actually have time to commit to this and to make it successful? Because there is the term in the industry called pod fading, and it definitely is like a real thing. Like, that's why there's so many inactive shows. That's why no one gets past that 10 episode mark, because it does take a lot of time commitment. And what people don't understand is that a lot of times your podcast happens from your house. And if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a business owner, that as soon as you get home, you're like, I got to check out. I got to leave, work at the door. If you do work from home, is this another thing you can do from your home? Like, are you going to be willing to make your room sound good and get the right mics and get all these things? Like, there's a lot of little steps that people don't understand before they start. So really asking yourself, like, do you have time to do this? Do you want to do this? And can you come up with endless amounts of content? That's the next thing that people get really stumbled on, is the content side of stuff. So do you have enough content, that you want to cover personally, but do you also know people you can bring on with interviews? Can you do you have friends, whether in your inner circle, do you have time to reach out to people that are maybe out of your circle, a little higher than you, or a little, further along in their career? Like, do you have time to put into the content side of it? Because those are the two things that are going to stumble you no matter what. And if people say, yes, I can come up with endless amounts of content, I know a lot of people in this space, like, I know I can over deliver, and I'm willing to put in the time of making it work in my home or at the office. If you can answer yes to both of those things, then you're like super ready for a podcast, 100%. And then, of course, like I said, there is a lot of stuff online, but make sure that you stick to one. If you don't go through a company like the Creative Podcast Company or the other ones that are out there, if you just go straight the Google route, you gotta, you're a super hardcore DIYer. I know you guys out there like that. You just it's like an entrepreneurial badge. Like, I figured this crap out myself. And that person that's listening, whenever you start Googling, stick to the same exact place. And let's face it, you might get some bad information out there. It's true. There's a lot of bad info about podcasting, but as soon as you find somewhere, stick to it, because people that, go to this blog to learn how to do this, and this YouTube channel to learn how to do this, and this, there's so many different elements going on. So when you go to Apple and they say like, hey, your podcast can't launch because of X, Y, and Z, then you can go back to where they led you wrong, if that makes sense, and then you can fix it really quickly. If you're consuming all these different DIY tutorials, then it's just a hot mess, like 100%. Like, you don't know where you went wrong, and then most people just stop after that. That's like the full DIY route. I mean, just stick to one place. And then really the third thing is like, I would just say, like, definitely keep going and find yourself a podcast buddy. Because it's very unique, the struggles you come up against as a podcaster, and no one will ever understand it unless you're also a podcaster. So find a podcast buddy, and then frankly, just have someone else do it for you. The more you can resource stuff out after your launch, or even within your launch. Like I said, that's what we do, is like, we help people actually launch their show. But the ongoing stuff, it's like the same thing every week, right? Like, there's the show notes, there's the timestamps, there's all these things, right, that you're adding. But making sure you resource out what's going to make your life easier, because whatever you can do to get your message out there and amplify your message is going to be the most important. And resourcing it out, if that helps you stay on track and share your message, then that's going to be the most beneficial thing for any podcaster.
Yes, 1,000 times. Yes. To quote one of my favorite movies. No, but like, there's so many times, I'll be real and transparent, that I've been like, hey, start a podcast. They said it'll be fun. They said, and it'll be like, I don't know, like 1 a.m. and I'm still editing the episode that I'm trying to get launched, for the next day, because I had a crazy busy weekend, whatever, crazy busy week, didn't get edited, but I want to make sure that that gets up, because I know that people are, expecting it to be there. And there's so many, like anything, like entrepreneurship. Let's go there. Like, entrepreneurship is this crazy, amazing, wonderful, terrifying, hard, rewarding, exciting, all of the adjectives journey. And there's so many times in that journey, like, you get into it and then you're like, what have I done? And I think the same is true for podcasting. And I just want to mention this just to encourage anybody who's like, okay, I want to start a podcast, but I'm scared. Like, you're going to have times like that. If you feel like you have no idea where to begin, I want to be transparent and say that was me a few months ago. I had no idea where to begin. And honestly, this podcast wouldn't exist if it were not for Cassidy. And like, she walked me through step by step. Here's what you need to know. Here's the website you need to click to submit your RSS feeds, like all of this, every single thing. I truly could not be more grateful for you. So I cannot say enough how much I recommend that you reach out to her, reach out to Creative Podcast Company to help you get set up. They also do all of the amazing things like make things like show notes, something you don't have to worry about. It's like my personal, every week I'm like, oh no, I have to write the show notes. But that's just being real. Like this is part of the podcast journey, but anything worth doing is worth continuing to do. I know like that's your number one thing, Cassidy, is like keep going. And like there's been nights that I've been, up late like editing an episode. I'm like, oh, maybe it'll just come out a little later this week, or or you get tired early, maybe I just won't do it. I'm like, I have to do it. I have to do it because Cassidy will know. But
I'm always watching.
But like I don't know. I don't mean to ramble about it, but I feel like people need that encouragement too. That yay, thank you, random pop up. I want to mention it because I feel like people need that encouragement too, that like anything, just like this entrepreneurship journey that you're on, that has its highs and lows and twists and whatever, like there's really reward when you keep going. And when you keep going and you amplify your message and you show up for the people that you feel, called to serve, like it impacts their life. It impacts your life. There's things you can do with monetizing your podcast that Cassidy can help you learn about too. But like, it's worth it. It's worth it. If you heard what we said today and you're like, that sounds awesome, I feel overwhelmed, don't feel overwhelmed. First of all, getting started is not as hard as you think it is. Cassidy can make it easy as 1, 2, 3, literally. I can't say enough about how much you need to reach out to Cassidy. You need to have her help you like get this set up because it's going to be done right. That's the other thing about DIY. Like for me, oh my gosh, I'm looking around at my office, like hanging things, whatever, like I can do it myself, but it's probably going to take a lot longer and there might be very many holes in the wall involved versus like hiring a professional. So you can do it yourself, but if you want to get it done and not have it be stressful and you want it done right, work with Cassidy 100%. But then also like when you get into the journey, first of all, know that every single podcaster goes through the journey that you're going to be going through, and also know that it's worth it. So Cassidy, thank you so much for being with us today. Now that I have basically said, if you want a podcast, you absolutely need to reach out to Cassidy Atkins. What is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, thank you so much. You're like a true professional and I love your heart for your community. So thanks for having me on. Of course, I got to say that before anything, I got to make sure I honor you. But yeah, so you can go to creativepodcast.co. That will show you a lot of the services, but also like we really love connecting with podcasters one-on-one. So you can always email support@creativepodcastco.com. That's a way, probably the fastest way to get our response is just to kind of so we can make it customizable to you, because we're going to show you the generic packages, of course, on the website, but if you can really say like, this is where I'm at in the podcast journey, because everybody is different. Everyone has different ideas, different different avatars, and we really try to make it customizable. So that's one way we love connecting with podcasters, is just straight to email, so we can give you the best and put you on the right path the quickest. And so that is support@creativepodcastco.com.
Awesome. Thank you. And I will put that link in the show notes as well. And Cassidy also has a podcast called Podception that has so many great tips and tricks and do's and don'ts and secrets for podcasters out there. So if this is something that you're interested to pursue, absolutely go check that out.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. So we hope you found great value in today's episode. If you did, please rate, review, subscribe, and share with your friends. I want to equip as many as I can to rock your brand like a boss. I'll catch you on the next episode. Keep rocking.